Hey everybody, my name is Michael Hirtzel. I'm the Social Studies Coordinator for Life Schools, and today I'm going to help you review exploration, and really we're going to get into the whys of why certain countries came and explored different areas. And so obviously, if you're listening to this, you're doing a review because maybe you didn't get a good score on your last test, and that's okay. This may take longer for you to understand than some other things, and there's going to be other parts of U.S. history that you're going to breeze through and maybe your classmates will struggle with. And so everybody is kind of struggles with different things, and that's fine. So I'm going to tell you, we're going to go over what you've already looked at in class, but I'm going to tell you kind of from a different perspective, and hopefully that will help you understand it a little bit better. It's always good to hear from multiple perspectives. All right, so let's begin. So before the arrival of Europeans, North America was dominated by diverse Indian groups, lots of different tribes, as you can see, and they all had their own territory that they were defending, and some of them would ally with each other most of them would ally with each other to fight other tribes that were kind of fighting for their territories. But if you look at the way that they all survived, there's very different ways. You can see from this map, a lot of them grew agriculture. They were agrarian, that's what we call that. Some of them were agrarian, and they would move to the coast and they would plant their agriculture, their crops, and they would then move to the coast for a small amount of time and fish, and then they would come back and they would harvest those crops. Some were just strictly hunters. You can see that in the green. Hunting and gathering, which means that they would move around. These are people who were fully nomadic, and nomadic means that you're just constantly moving, hunting and gathering berries and nuts and different things to eat. And there's people who were fishing. So just a lot of different ways to live. It's very interesting. We don't have a lot of perspective to think about the way that our country was before Europeans came, but this map really gives you a good idea of that. So in the East, Indians like the Iroquois and the Powhatans and the Cherokees were settled in farming villages, and these are the people who are the Europeans or the English are going to come in contact with first. And a lot of the conflicts that they have early on with them, we read about and we'll study about later on. There you see the Iroquois farmers, a depiction of them farming in there. They're actually growing maize there. It's another name for corn. Maize is the Spanish name for corn. And remember that Europe didn't actually have corn before European exploration. And we'll also talk about that a little bit further later. In the Central Plains, Indians like the Sioux and the Cheyenne hunted buffaloes using mass hunting techniques. And so you'll see a picture of that here. Really interesting. What they used to do was sometimes they would just hunt them with spears like we see sometimes in depictions. But here you see that they would run buffaloes off of plateaus. So they would, they'd get the buffaloes running in a herd, and then the buffaloes would only see the buffalo in front of them as they were running, and they would just run off these cliffs and kill massive amounts of them. And the Native Americans were very skilled in using every part of the buffalo for their survival. In Central America, the Aztecs formed a powerful empire and dominated surrounding Indians. And the way that they did that was a tributary system where basically the city, what is now Mexico City, they would force other surrounding cities to pay them tribute. And so that was part of their empire. Kind of the way that Rome operated, kind of like that, a little bit different, but they would basically make all those surrounding cities pay tribute and then become a part of their empire and help them fight anyone who would come up against them and want to go to war with them. A very wealthy empire. Okay, and that's the picture of their capital. So during the Renaissance, a desire for new trade routes to Asia led to an age of exploration. And you can see all of these different exploration routes during the Renaissance. European explorers found new trade routes and formed overseas colonies. And this becomes a very important point. When you have an overseas colony, what that would do was you would use that overseas colony to pump natural resources back into your mother country. So say Spain, for instance, they would go to Central and South America and they would take gold and silver from those areas and bring that back to Spain. And that eventually is going to make Spain the most powerful country in the world. And so once Spain does that, and we'd also seen it in Portugal, and as you can see, I'll get to that in a second. So you can see it from Portugal around the Gold Coast of Africa. They'd become very wealthy by exploring those trade routes. And so other countries want to get in on that. That's making Spain and Portugal very influential countries, and other countries want to do that. So there's a desire to get natural resources out of other areas and bring them back to the mother country to make the mother country more powerful. Okay, so I'm going to use my pointer here, and I'm going to actually let me use the pointer here, a line. I'm going to draw a line. I've never done this before, so bear with me. But this is not a very straight line. But what you'll see here is this is the Treaty of Tordesillas, and we talked about that before. And so to this side of the Treaty of Tordesillas, Spain could explore everything, and to this side, Portugal could explore everything. That was put in place by the Pope so that these two countries that were right next to each other wouldn't fight. And so you see this one area right here that is on this side on the right side of the Treaty of Tordesillas, and so that is Portuguese, and that's Brazil, which is, even today, if you go to Brazil, they speak Portuguese. Now, on the left side of the Treaty of Tordesillas, they're going to speak Spanish, which they still speak today. So Christopher Columbus is going to discover America in 1492, and the reason why there's quotation marks around discovery is because it was a European discovery, not necessarily the first people who had been there, but for Europe it was a discovery, and that's going to transform the future of American Indians. And that whole Treaty of Tordesillas came about because of Christopher Columbus. So in 1492 he goes there, in 1493 he returns, and he says, hey, there's this whole area over here that we need to explore. And Portugal says, Spain says, we don't want Portugal exploring this, and so they create that Treaty of Tordesillas. So Portugal is the first country to settle in the Americas, but they settle in Brazil. So once that treaty is done, Portuguese are already very skilled at navigating. They're the best at navigating, and so they're like, hey, let's go down to that area and settle it. The arrival of Europeans led to the introduction of new products. So what's really interesting about all of this is that other places don't have, North and South America didn't have horses before the Europeans came. And so a lot of the images that we see of Native Americans riding horses, chasing buffalo, well, that only came about because Europeans brought horses to North and South America. On the other end of it, things like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, a lot of sweet potatoes, pumpkins, tobacco, all these things that we see as just a normal thing. We think that maybe Europe had those forever. They actually didn't. They didn't have those until European exploration. And so you have the Columbian Exchange is the name that we give to understand all of those different things that came to both North and South America and Europe that they didn't have previously. The introduction of potatoes and corn really helped the diets and life expectancy of people throughout the world. In Europe, especially, there weren't any staple crops like corn and potatoes that helped the population survive. That's a very cheap and easy thing to grow, both of those items, and people can live off of those even if they don't have a lot of money. The introduction of European grains, horses, and cattle transformed a lot of Indian culture. So Indians, as I said before, didn't have They didn't have grains. They didn't have horses. They didn't have cattle. They didn't have any of those things, and so that transforms them as well. And how they hunt and what they have to hunt for. They could use horses to hunt buffaloes, as you see there. But then some people, because of cattle, didn't necessarily need to hunt as much. So very interesting. What is a terrible thing that happened because of this is the introduction of European diseases like smallpox and influenza. So by the time the Pilgrims landed, 90% of Native Americans had died from diseases, which is terrible. And let me explain the way that happened. So when you go home today and you kiss or maybe you're at home right now and you've got your dog cuddled up next to you or your cat, well, you actually are sharing diseases with your animals that you have at home. You get viruses from them and they get viruses from you. Now, why does that not make you sick? Well, the reason why is because people have been around those animals for so long that the body has adapted and no longer gets sick from that. So, a good example of that is getting a vaccination where you get a small amount of a disease. And what that does in your body is it makes your body attack that disease, and then you're immune to it. You're not going to get it anymore. And so what happened in Europe is people had those immunities. Their bodies had built up resistance to those viruses that they were giving back and forth to their cattle and livestock and sheep and pigs. But when they brought those livestock to North and South America, as well as when they brought themselves to North and South America, those natives didn't have any of those immunities built up in their bodies. So if you went to somebody today and met with them, and they had never ever been around a dog or a cat. Say they were living in a bubble and they had never been around that, and none of their ancestors had, and you just went around them, they would get very sick from you because they would get those viruses that you had. And so that's what happened with the Native Americans. They didn't have any immunities. Their bodies hadn't built up immunities or ways to fight those diseases, and so many of them died. As you can see, the native population of Central America goes down significantly as well by 1620. So again, by the time the Pilgrims arrive, 90% of Native Americans in North America had died from those diseases. So Spain sent explorers called conquistadors to the New World to find gold and conquer lands. And so they are mainly interested, and most people are mainly interested in, most countries are mainly interested in sending people to find gold. And the reason why is because obviously Spain is going to send people to find gold, and they're going to find it. And before that, Portugal had sent people to find gold down the Gold Coast of Africa, and they had found it. And so that's going to be high on the list of things that people want to get out of these colonies. So Cortez is going to conquer the Aztecs. A really interesting story with Cortez. He lands on the coast of what we now know today as Mexico, and he turns around and burns his ships. Right? That's crazy, right? He burned his ship, so how's he going to get home? Well, he had a shipbuilder with him that could build ships, obviously. And so he burned them. And the reason why, he told his men, he said, either we succeed or we die. Those are the only two options. And so he went in and basically took over what is now Mexico City, the Aztec capital, and was eventually kicked out and kind of fled for his life, built ships and went back. But by that time, when he went back, he had these stories of how rich the Aztecs were, how much gold they had, and that so that's only going to create more discovery and exploration. Pizarro is going to conquer the Inca. It's also a very interesting story. We don't have enough time to go over each one of these individuals, but very interesting. So gold from America increased Spain's wealth and power. And what is very interesting is, I try to relate things that you guys have heard of before. And one of the things that I tried to talk about is you've probably heard of the Pirates of the Caribbean, right? You've seen the movie or you've heard about it. Well, that's a real thing. So the Caribbean, or the Caribbean, people call it both of those things, and both of those are correct, is kind of right in here. And so Spain was... they were sending ships out of Central America as well as South America with all kinds of gold and silver. And if you were a pirate and you were able to take one of those ships and steal their gold or silver, you would be rich for life. Everyone on that ship would be rich for life. And so that created a lot of pirates that kind of hung out in this area. They also hid up here in North America, in what is now the United States, off of the coast there. And they would steal this gold on the way out. But, Spain still got a ton of gold out, and so they become the richest country and the most powerful country in the world because of that. The success of Spanish colonies encouraged other European powers to form permanent colonies in North America. The English, the Dutch, the Swedish, the French. And so we're going to talk about some of those. The very first permanent settlement, European settlement in North America, was St. Augustine, and we just actually talked about why they did it. So the Spanish are going to settle St. Augustine in Florida here, and the reason why is because they wanted a port and a fort that they could use to defend against these pirates in the Caribbean Sea. And so that's the first permanent establishment, and that was a permanent settlement, and that is a Spanish settlement. So in the 1600s and the 1700s, Spain's going to dominate Central and South America and the southeast and south regions of North America. So why did the Spanish colonize in America? And we're going to ask this question about each of the countries. Well, the Spanish conquistadors were searching for gold and silver. There was actually a dual purpose in why they were exploring. They wanted gold and silver. They also wanted to convert natives. And what we'll see in a second is that one was more important than the other. I bet you can guess which is more important, gold and silver or converting natives to Christianity and Catholicism. So here you go. Here's the other reason. They converted Indians to Catholicism and created missions in America. But what we see is that eventually, because they find no gold in North America, and because North America is just, what we now consider the United States, number one, it didn't have any gold, but number two, it had very hostile Indians. Not like the Aztecs. It had many different tribes. It wasn't like you could conquer one group of people and you would be done. There was all these different tribes that would attack the French or the Spanish. And so it becomes a big problem for the Spanish and kind of more of a headache than they want, especially with no gold being produced there. And so eventually they're going to leave these areas of the south portion of what is now the United States. So what was the structure like? They had a governor, royal viceroy, who was kind of like a governor over the land. The colonists couldn't vote, and they didn't have very many freedom. So as we said before, the economy of the Spanish colonies was based on mining gold and silver. Haciendas and plantations also became important, and they figured out, hey, this is another way to make money, is we can export cash crops like sugar. Right, so you can see how the Spanish colonies were strictly controlled. You have viceroys at the top, which are the royal governors. You have white Spanish colonists who had land and wealth. And you had, a lack of colonial women led to intermarriages between white colonists and Indians. And interestingly enough, so if you were to do a DNA test on most people that live in Central and South America now, there are very few people who are just completely native to Central and South America. Most people, if you did a DNA test on them, you would find that they have Spanish DNA in them as well, and that came from the racial marriages and children from those marriages. Native Indians and African slaves made up the bottom of colonial society, and that's not to say that the first African slaves came from Spain. They actually came from Portugal. Remember, Portugal had access to the Gold Coast of Africa, and so they also had access to Brazil, and so they're going to start bringing slaves from Africa to Brazil. Tribes would conquer one another in Africa, and they would enslave those people, and they would sell them to the Portuguese. In 1600s, French Samuel de Champlain failed to find the Northwest Passage. And so what he's looking for is like a passageway, like a river that ran all the way through up here. And that doesn't exist, so no one ever found it. But he did create the colony of Quebec. And France claimed land from Canada to New Orleans and controlled the territory along the Mississippi River. So what you're going to have is they're going to control this entire area. They're going to control the entire area of Louisiana, which they'll eventually sell to the United States when Thomas Jefferson is the president. But for now, they control that area. And then Quebec, obviously, which is Canada now as well. So why did the French colonize in America? Like Spain, the French colonized focused on wealth and converting Indians to Catholicism. But the way that they focused on wealth was completely different. They were mainly going to be trappers and fur traders. So most French colonists profited from the fur trade, small-scale farming, or lumbering. But mostly, when you think about French and the French and colonization for the French, you should think about fur trade. Now, this is going to have an impact on their relationship with Native Americans. Because the French needed furs, they're going to be friendly with many of the local Indians. And so later on, when the British go to war with the French, you can see, who's going to side with the French. Well, the Native Americans are, because they have a relationship with the French from their years and years of fur trading with them. When you trade with someone, you have to be nice to them most of the time, and so you want to have a good relationship with them. And that's, for the most part, what the French did. They also had some enemies, but for the most part, they were friendly with the local Indians. French colonists had to be Catholic, so they also tried to convert the natives, but for the most part, they were mostly concerned with trading furs. And you can see the structure here of the French governments within their colonies, similar to both the Spanish and the English. All right, so let's talk about the Dutch. The Dutch created a colony in present-day New York City called New Amsterdam that became New Netherlands. Why did they colonize in America? Well, they hoped for trade. So they weren't into fur trading. They weren't into trying to find gold or silver. They really just wanted to trade with the newly established colonies and that Columbian exchange that we talked about before. So they wanted to profit from trade in America. To attract settlers, what they did, now think about this. When you think about new colonies, you have to understand that not very many people from Europe wanted to come. And the reason why is because there were high amounts of death within these colonies, especially at the very beginning of the colonies. You weren't going to a very well-established area such as France or England or Spain, where these countries had been around for a long time. You were going to this kind of newly established area where you could die from disease or Native American attack or all kinds of different things. And so you had to kind of think, who would leave their comfortable life in Europe and come to these colonies? Well, a lot of times people that didn't have a comfortable life in Europe. Sometimes they were people who didn't have very many options. Sometimes they were people who wanted religious freedom, and sometimes they were people who came from a wealthy family that was really they had to kind of make a name for themselves and have honor, and they were looking for fame. So all kinds of different reasons why people came. As a result, New Netherlands was one of the most free and diverse colonies in America. Now, to get people to come there, they said, we don't care what religion you are. We don't care. We don't care. We just want you to come. And so a lot of people came to the Dutch colonies, because of that. And so they were kind of known as a free and diverse colony. So let's talk about the British. The British, like the Dutch, the British settled in America through joint stock companies. In 1585, Great Britain established Roanoke Colony, which was the first first British colony in North America. And really, we think of it as the first American colony, which would eventually lead to the British colonies and then America, the United States as we know it today. So that was Roanoke. It was led by Sir Walter Raleigh, but it was there for 3 years and then disappeared. Nobody knows. So somebody went back to England for supplies. They came back and there was a mysterious message written in a tree, and and everyone was gone. So nobody knows what happened to it. There's even still people today that are trying to find the answer to that. So British colonists, why did they come? Well, they came for a variety of reasons. Some colonists came to America to escape poverty and gain wealth or gain land. Some came for religious freedom and to flee religious persecution. And some came to escape violence during the English War. A lot of different reasons. You can't really claim one. There were lots of different reasons. Some people wanted to get rich. Some people wanted religious freedom. As a result, the British colonies were very different from each other and were never very unified. So there wasn't one reason why everyone was coming to these colonies. And so there wasn't one thing that united them. There were many different people and many different motivations for people coming there, as well as different trades and industries that they were a part of. Some were farmers up north, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, all the different things that these colonies did. So Britain developed a policy called salutary neglect, much like the others. When you talk about France and Spain, they had the same kind of structure in their government. But here's the thing. The British Crown didn't really want to deal with the day-to-day, the week-to-week, the month-to-month problems that happened in the colonies. And so what they did, instead of dealing with those issues, is they said, you guys can kind of create your own colonial assemblies, you can create your own councils, and then you can make decisions for yourself, like taxing, what amount of taxes you pay, what kind of local laws you have, and things like that. So they said, the British Crown is going to benefit from the natural resources from the new colonies, but we want to have as little to do with the day-to-day operations as possible. We don't want to have to deal with that. And so they kind of neglected the governing duties that they had, and that's another very important thing. Colonists are going to become very self-dependent, and when the British Crown does kind of put their thumb down and say, we want more control now, we're going to stop neglecting you, the colonists are not going to like that very much. Right, so the royal governors were sent by the king, but they didn't have very much power because of those councils and colonial assemblies. Right, so the societies and economies of British colonies were dependent upon the reasons people settled there. Southern colonies like Virginia had cash crops, so we're talking about these areas here. They had cash crops, not really cotton at that time, although we think of cotton as the southern crop. That's going to come later. But cash crops like indigo and tobacco were very abundant there, and they grew a lot. Very good land for growing things. Now, in New England colonies in Massachusetts, they were closely connected by religion. Remember, the Puritans were the ones who ran most of that. And their economies were based largely on subsistence farming. So they would farm just enough so that their families would have something to eat. And then they would also be involved in things like fishing and trade in their ports, and many other things, not just that. Unlike the Spanish or the French, the British colonists never tried hard to convert, marry, or trade with local Indians. So whereas you have the French who are becoming friends with natives, the British colonists are different. They don't really want to become friends. They don't really want to convert or marry or trade with local Indians. And the reason why is because the British have a very different way of thinking about why they're there. The British colonies are there to settle. That's their new home. They're staying there. Whereas the French would come and go. The French would kind of come in and trade a little bit and then go back. It was kind of the same with the Spanish. They would come in, they would get their gold, they would leave. The British colonies were establishing their new home. And so that new home was their way of life was very different than many of the Native Americans. The nomadic or even semi-nomadic, where they kind of always move around. No one person really owns property. The entire tribe owns a territory. Very different ideals and ways of thinking when it came to the way that they should live. And that conflicted with the way that colonists thought that they should live. And so they didn't really try to become friends with them or convert them or marry them. For the most part, there were some good relationships with early colonists, but there were some very bad and tense relationships as well. All right, so that should give you a good idea of the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch and the British colonies and why they came. Hopefully this helps you review for the test that you're about to take so that you can get a higher grade. And hope it helps. Until next time.